Hello and welcome to History Rebels. Today we're discussing some of the complexities of the American Revolutionary War. Beyond a what-if scenario, we're exploring how Britain, with its global naval dominance and experience in North America, approached the conflict. Could they have won the war, or were their efforts doomed by strategic missteps and external pressures? To unpack these questions, we're joined by the renowned historian, Professor Jeremy Black, whose book on the subject, The War for American Independence, offers us a thorough and page-turning insight into the conflict. Professor Black has written detailed diplomatic, military, and social histories, and you can find out more in the links in the description. So let's explore whether a British victory was ever within reach, or whether American independence was truly inevitable. A very warm welcome, Professor. I wanted to start by asking you to set the scene for us. On the eve of the revolution in 1775, could you tell us about the state and ability of the British military and what power they could project?
Well, Britain in 1775 had the largest navy in the world. And it was combat ready. I mean, the British already had done very well in the 7 Years' War for the Americans, the French and Indian War, which the Brits date at 1756 to 63, and the Americans at 1754 to 63. And as recently as 1762, British amphibious operations had taken both Manila and Havana, the two principal Spanish overseas bases. So the British had the largest navy in the world. As far as their army was concerned, there is a misconception that the British Army was rigid, didn't have any idea how to fight counterinsurgency wars, etc. But in fact, it was quite experienced in counterinsurgency warfare. It had succeeded in beating the Jacobites eventually, defeating them in both 1716 and 1746. And many of the same people involved in the latter were also involved in at least the early stages of the War of American Independence. And lastly, the British had extensive experience of campaigning in North America. They had campaigned in North America in every single war against the French, and they had also campaigned there on occasion against the Spaniards, and they had campaigned there against the Native Americans. So the British had extensive experience, and not just experience of attacking coastal positions like Louisburg, the major French base on Cape Breton Island, which had been captured in 1745 and 1758, or places that could be readily reached by inland places readily reached by a maritime expedition or a river expedition, such as Quebec in 1759. But British forces had also advanced overland through often very challenging terrain, as in, for example, 1758, 59, and 1760.
In our series so far, we've seen how both British politicians in London and commanders in the field in North America failed to properly coordinate, which in 1777 leads to the defeat at Saratoga. Could you tell us about British decision-making and strategies throughout the war, and what approaches or resources like the Royal Navy and American loyalists could have been employed to change the outcome?
Well, no outcome is foredoomed, as it were. Clearly, plotting a strategy, or rather plotting operational means on the other side of the Atlantic was not easy, no more than it was easy for Britain's opponents, of course. And I think if one is looking to try and summarize the strategy, I would say there are different stages. In 1775, the government mistakenly assumed that opposition was concentrated simply in Massachusetts, and as a result, the government concentrated its forces there. Authority collapsed in the other colonies, and eventually, although the British were able to maintain their position in Boston late 75, early 76, they had to clear out in March 76. The British then sent a very significant expeditionary force to North America, In fact, they sent more than one. One force, of course, relieved Quebec and drove the Americans out of Canada. The other force, of course, concentrated on Staten Island, beat Washington on Long Island, and then successfully invaded Manhattan. And this represented a significant dispatch of forces at a time when Britain had no other conflict going on. And I think it's fair to say that the same was pursued in 1777 and the beginning in 1778. But in 1778, the British had to switch to a different strategy because France came into the war. Britain was therefore perforce involved in a world war, or a world war as far as the extent of Britain's colonial interests and maritime concerns were involved. And then, of course, in 1779, Spain came in as well. So by that stage, you have got differing issues. Now, you're absolutely right to talk about coordination. And I would have thought the most significant failure of coordination is not Saratoga. The most significant failure of coordination is Virginia Capes, the inability of the Navy to concentrate enough warships and they had plenty of warships in the Western Hemisphere, but to concentrate enough warships at the entrance to the Chesapeake to force a relief of Cornwallis's army there. Because if they'd done that, the army could have withdrawn, as indeed Clinton's army had withdrawn from the New Jersey shore in 1778 after the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. So coordination is difficult. It's difficult tactically. It's difficult operationally. It's difficult strategically. But that is the nature of warfare if you're looking at warfare before the age of the radio. And I think, in a way, it's anachronistic to argue that the British were uniquely flawed in this respect.
Could you delve slightly further into that for us? I'm interested in what impact some of the personalities had. So for the British, for example, the first two commanders-in-chief, Generals Gage and then Howe, having arguably sympathies for the Americans and perhaps not prosecuting the war as aggressively as they may have done against the French, for example. What impact do these characters, these personalities have? And is that a fair argument to make regarding Gage and Howe?
Well, that's often been argued, and Ira Gruber's biographers, for example, makes that point. I think it's worth bearing in mind that this was a civil war in which what the British were trying to do was persuade sufficient Americans, or sufficient, if you like, patriots, to not fight them. And by the nature of things, what you might call a hard war is not necessarily a brilliant way to do that. I mean, you're talking about the War of Independence. I've just been finishing off a manuscript on the American Civil War. And as you may know, there was a similar tension within the Union generals, but differences between those who wanted a more emollient form of war making, of which the most famous, but by no means the only one, was George B. McClellan, and those who favoured what was called the hard hand of war, of whom the most famous were Ulysses Grant, William Sherman, and Philip Sheridan. And of course, it's not that one was right and the other was wrong, because they were advocating different strategies. I mean, McClellan fought the 1864 presidential election against Lincoln as the candidate of the Democrat Party, which had a different agenda. So if you wind back to a different agenda to that of the Republicans and wanted peace on more conciliatory grounds. So if you wind back to the War of Independence, ultimately that war would have been pointless if the British had had to leave a significant and expensive garrison army there. The only way for that to be in the long term successful was to persuade the Americans to stop fighting. And providing, as it were, atrocity stories was not going to do that.
In the early years of the war, the British win a number of important victories, and at times American capitulation seems possible. For example, after Washington is defeated in the New York campaign in 1776, or after General Howe captures the capital, Philadelphia, in 77. What would it have taken for Congress to sue for peace? And what does a realistic British victory actually look like?
Well, I mean, if obviously we're talking about hypotheticals or counterfactuals, to use the term, and I'm very interested in counterfactuals. I've written two books on counterfactuals, so I'm interested in the subject. But nobody knows what might have happened. I mean, obviously, as you may be aware, American patriot leaders said, John Adams, for example, and Benjamin Franklin said, there's no way we're going to treat with the British after they've made war on us. But in fact, that was precisely what happened when, for example, Charleston surrendered in 1780. And there was in the Carolina Low Country a sort of process of return to loyalty. So it is possible that a more dramatic or complete, whatever one means by that term, victory or series of victories might well have produced a different political settlement. But it's very unclear where one's going with this because there's two types of political settlement one can envisage. One was a kind of political settlement along the lines of the terms that the Howe brothers were authorized to make in 1776 and of the Carlisle Commission, the Earl of Carlisle being dispatched to North America in 1778. And these are settlements which, in effect, concede self-government to the colonists, but say they have to remain within the British imperial system. And it's possible that a compromise could have been reached on those terms. One's thinking here of Dominion status before the name. The other alternative is to say, well, actually, what the war did was lead to a partition of British North America, with obviously the colonies that constitute what we now call Canada, remaining with Britain, Florida, east and west, going to Spain. The Spaniards had conquered West Florida, East Florida had remained under the British, and the rest going to the Americans. And you could say, well, it would have been possible to have envisaged a different territorial settlement, maybe with Georgia or maybe even South Carolina, staying with Britain. And the answer is yes, these are possible, but we don't know. It's certainly the case that as late as 1781, nobody had the faintest idea of what was going to happen. The crucial indicator to my mind is French policy. And I've written a book on French foreign policy in the 18th century. And it's quite clear that Vergennes, by the beginning of the French foreign minister, who's very influential in French policymaking, by the beginning of the 1780s, is getting more concerned about the rise of Russian power in Eastern Europe, and specifically Russian territorial ambitions on Crimea and more generally on the Ottoman Empire. Vergennes had served as French ambassador at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. And Vergennes wanted peace with Britain. And he wanted a reconciliation with Britain in which Britain would cooperate with France in a new European order. So in a way, for the Americans, they're in difficulties. They've got to try and get the British to provide them with good terms before the French pull out of the war. And again, to my mind, there is a similarity with another war I've written on, the War of 1812, in which, quite frankly, it doesn't really matter after November 1812 what happened in the battles, I mean, which is what the historians tend to focus on, because America had, as it were, backed the weaker side. It had assumed that Britain would be defeated by Napoleon. Well, and then the Americans had an envoy with Napoleon's army. Once Napoleon has to pull back from Moscow, the Americans realize they've got it wrong. And in fact, they try and begin negotiations with the British via variously the Russians and the Swedes. And from then on, the Americans are in trouble, irrespective of what happens in the fighting. And that's a perspective that I'm afraid to say most people fail to really appreciate when they're looking at the War of American Independence, because they don't think strategically. They don't look at it in this broader span. Ultimately, the Americans could not knock Britain out of the war. They simply couldn't do it. And, because the British could always strike back, as they'd shown in 1776, and because American troops were scarcely going to be landing in Pembrokeshire and marching on London. So ultimately, the Americans are dependent either on the French and Spaniards knocking Britain out of the war, and there was a Franco-Spanish invasion attempt in 1779, which was a dismal failure, wrecked in large part by diarrhea, in fact. And alternatively, they had to actually find some way of signaling to the Brits that this is a war that ain't going to go well for them. Well, the Americans proved singularly unsuccessful in that. I mean, remember, there is a general election during the war. The general election is held in 1780, and who wins? Well, the answer is Lord North's government wins. And having won in 1780, we're at this stage under the Septennial Act. They don't need another general election till 1787. So unless the government, for some reason, falls or loses purpose or loses a sense of determination, all the Americans can do is win battles in the field, which don't necessarily translate to strategic advantage.
So this is another counterfactual, but thinking of the geopolitics, how decisive is the French and the Spanish intervention? And had the British been successful in hampering Benjamin Franklin in Paris and stopping the creation of the Franco-American alliance in 1778, does that change the outcome of the war?
No, I'm afraid I don't agree with you. That Benjamin Franklin doesn't create the Franco-American alliance. I mean, again, people grotesquely exaggerate his influence. In 1778, the French government had a choice. It could determine to go alongside its ally Austria against Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War that is beginning, or it could determine on conflict with Britain. There was no certainty as to what it was going to do, and you can actually follow the debates in the French archives, in the Archives étrangères, Foreign Ministry archives, which include the representations of each of the ministers in the council. And Franklin, quite frankly, is rather insignificant in this. So no, I would say that the French are extremely important, not just in their own right, but also in bringing the Spaniards into the war in 1779 against the Americans. And the Spaniards had been quite reluctant. Excellent book by Light Cummins on Spain and the American Revolution. The Spaniards have been quite reluctant because they were worried about the impact in terms of the example made on their own colonists. And the French are also important for helping to sustain and develop opposition to Britain in India, particularly by sending an expeditionary force which goes there in 1780 and which aligns with Hyder Ali, Sultan of Mysore, and then after 82 with his son Tipu Sultan. So I would say France was very important indeed. I think France alters the strategy of the war, it alters its politics, it alters its geopolitics, it alters its operational methods, and it makes it in part a naval war as well, which it really wasn't prior to that because the Continental Navy was not capable of fleet action.
Considering the powerful ideas that come out of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, even if the British had won a military victory and maintained nominal or partial control of the 13 colonies, was the cat out of the bag in 76 in terms of the revolutionary ideas within the Declaration, making American independence really just a matter of time?
Well, that's a problematic argument because, in a sense, the Jacobite risings had not led to whatever one, in the long term, whatever one means by Scottish independence, but more particularly in 1798, there's a rising in Ireland. The rising is suppressed, and Ireland doesn't become independent of rule from Westminster to the beginning of the 1920s. So no, I don't think there's anything that's inevitable. I think it's actually, if the war had ended with a very unpopular settlement from the point of view of the Americans, then obviously it would have been problematic for Britain during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period because, Americans might well have looked to France. Although, of course, in the 1790s, That involves allying with an atheistical France, which is not popular. And you can see that with the Federalists in the 1790s keeping France at bay. It's only when Jefferson comes in that attitudes change. So I don't think one could envisage any fixed path. And as far as the Declaration of Independence is concerned, and more generally, as far as independence movements are concerned, there were bold independence statements at a variety of times. One can think, for example, of the Poles, who tried to rise against the attempt to partition them out of existence by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and they failed. And Poland then doesn't become independent until 1918. So the fact that you might wish an end, and indeed might offer radical political ideas, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to succeed. And again, let us return, although there are political differences, there's no doubt about it. If you look at the next big secession war in America, the next bit in North America, there are ones in South America, of course. The next big secession war in North America is the American Civil War, and the secessionist group, who have quite happy to fight and take heavy casualties, lose. And you could argue, if you wish to push the comparison further, you could argue that in 1861 to 65, the decisive difference is that no foreign power comes in on behalf of the South. And that the crucial variable for the War of Independence is that the world's second largest naval power comes in against Britain, followed incidentally by the world's third largest naval power, Spain.
As a final question, when I read about the Revolutionary War, there's often an inevitability narrative that I think particularly grew in the post-war telling of the conflict. How do you view that today as a historian?
One of the things I've tried to do in my work on military history is to show that a lot of the standard assumptions are flawed. Doesn't mean that one can't, as it were, find merit, at least in part, in some of the arguments, but one has to work harder at them rather than just assuming something is inevitably going to occur. So it seems to be widely assumed that it was inevitable that the American patriots would win. Win what is, on the one hand, the first big American Civil War, and secondly, a war of independence against the British. One has to be very careful of assuming any pattern of inevitability, and certainly any idea that there was some form of military superiority based on whatever one means by people's warfare. Because it's worth bearing in mind, as I've shown in my book on insurrections and counterinsurgency warfare, insurrections do not necessarily succeed. And one has to be very cautious, as I've tried to show on a number of works, one has to be very cautious about assuming the weakness of ancien regime powers. It is worth bearing in mind that in 1815, Napoleon is off the stage. The French Revolution has totally failed, and the dominant military powers in the European world are Russia on land and Britain at sea. And that scarcely matches an argument in favor of insurrectionary proficiency. So I think basically what I'm saying is people need to raise their game if they want to work on the subject.
We'll certainly try to raise our game here. Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much for watching. You can find more of Jeremy's work and his books in the links in the description. And if you like our content at History Rebels, please consider liking and subscribing. You can also join our Patreon for free, where you can ask questions for future interviews like this and vote on the next videos. Thanks again for watching, and until next time.